Governments and planning agencies at all levels, the health industry, and providers of sports and recreation facilities and equipment all have an interest in the level of physical activity undertaken by people in the community.
Well, the way that we've been doing it here is, and with state and federal governments, is to obviously measure at population level how often are people active, what are they actually doing, and are they doing enough activity to actually get some sort of health gain out of it.
But how do we go about measuring levels of physical activity? This program is about measuring physical activity. We'll examine the Australian National Physical Activity Guidelines and how active people should be. We'll then explore subjective and objective methods of measuring physical activity, domains of physical activity, and the Physical Activity Program. Australia is a nation of sports lovers, but like most developed countries around the world, the majority of its population does not engage in sufficient levels of physical activity that will enhance health and well-being. In 1999, the Australian government rewrote a set of guidelines about recommended levels of physical activity. A healthier population brings many advantages to a nation. People are more motivated, more productive, are less likely to suffer conditions like heart disease and diabetes, and they enjoy better mental health. It also assists governments to keep health costs down. The National Physical Activity Guidelines are a series of recommendations about levels of activity for 3 demographics: children aged 5 to 12, adolescents aged 12 to 18, and adults.
What they're there for is really to give a guide to adults, to children, to adolescents, to what should they be doing in terms of activity in their daily lives, how much should they be doing, what they should be doing, and why they should be doing it.
There are 4 general guidelines. The first is to think of movement as an opportunity to improve health, not an inconvenience. The human body was designed to move, but today's technology has resulted in far less physical activity being required in everyday life. Consequently, we have developed a mindset that has seen people become physically lazy. The prevailing attitude is that we minimize our physical activity rather than maximize it. Many people regard physical activity as something that is done only when absolutely necessary. Their lifestyle is such that exercise is avoided as much as possible. But this first recommendation is that our attitude should be one that looks for opportunities to exercise whenever possible.
Well, I guess our activity is determined by not only our own sort of genetics and our own desire to be active, but also the environments in which we live. A good example now is that it's very hard to find stairs in big buildings, so you use the elevator. So that's sort of urban, that's sort of building design. We know that in new areas, for example, where they're not building footpaths, that if you don't have a footpath outside your place, then you're more likely to be overweight. We know that if you live on a freeway, you're more likely to be overweight, much more likely to be overweight than if you don't.
The second guideline is to be active every day in as many ways as you can. This recommendation encourages individuals to incorporate physical activity into daily activities by making choices such as walking or cycling for transport as much as they can, and doing things for themselves as much as possible rather than using labour-saving devices. Examples include taking stairs instead of elevators, getting up to switch appliances on and off instead of using remote controls, and doing your own household chores rather than paying people to do them for us. The third guideline recommends that individuals participate in at least 30 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity on most, preferably all days. Moderate intensity exercise isn't vigorous, but does raise breathing and heart rates. Examples include brisk walking, playing ball games in the park, digging in the garden, or moderate level swimming and cycling. The fourth guideline is that people, where they are able, should enjoy some regular vigorous activity for extra health and fitness. Examples of vigorous activity include playing a game of tennis or squash, aerobics, basketball or football, circuit training, rowing, power walking or jogging. Many people are interested in measuring physical activity levels, including governments and various industry sectors. The Australian National Physical Activity Guidelines recommend physical activity levels for adults, adolescents and children. The 4 guidelines for adults are to view physical activity as an opportunity, not an inconvenience, to be active every day, to do 30 minutes of moderate exercise a day, and do regular, vigorous activity for greater fitness. The main purpose of National Physical Activity Guidelines is to establish minimum levels of activity that are required to enhance general health. For children and adolescents, the guidelines recommend a higher level of physical activity than for adults.
We have a higher recommendation of minutes per day for children because that's a key time in the lifespan. It's important for bone development. It's determined before the age of 12, as is the total number of fat cells that you develop. So it's really important that kids get a really good start, and they need more activity during that time than adults. So childhood's a key window for physical activity behaviour.
Children aged 5 to 12 need the highest level of physical activity.
For 5 to 12-year-olds, it's recommended that they engage in about 60 minutes a day, but up to several hours is preferable, and that's every day, 7 days a week.
Children of this age are going through important stages of physical development, and their activity levels need to be higher. But as people get older, physical activity levels tend to decline.
Right across the animal world, there's an association between increasing age and it's associated with a decrease in activity level. So pretty much from birth, you'll see a decrease.
Adolescents too are still developing physically and should keep activity levels up.
The national guidelines recommend that 12 to 18-year-olds engage in about 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity a day, and they also recommend that they spend no more than 2 hours a day using electronic media. So that's things like watching television, surfing the net, playing computer games.
As adults, the body does not develop physically at anywhere near the same rate as in younger years, and for older adults, ageing means the body is less able to be physically active.
Adults, we have a 30-minute per day recommendation, and that can be accumulated across the day in 10-minute bouts. So it doesn't have to be 30 minutes of sustained activity, it can be 3 by 10 minutes a day. And we recommend that adults are at least moderately active on most days, and we call most days 5 or more days per week.
Overweight and obese individuals need to participate in more activity than the guidelines recommend in order to lose weight. For overweight or obese adults, at least 60 minutes of physical activity is recommended to achieve weight loss, and between 60 and 90 minutes of accumulated activity a day to prevent putting the weight back on. For overweight and obese children and adolescents, because their activity tends to vary considerably with age and physical development, there are no set recommendations, except that they engage in more physical activity than set down in the national guidelines. National Physical Activity Guidelines recommend minimum levels of physical activity for the enhancement of health. Recommended activity levels are higher for younger people as they are going through important stages of physical development. Children aged 5 to 12 are recommended to do between 60 minutes and a few hours of moderate to vigorous activity daily. For adolescents, it's 60 minutes a day, and for adults, 30 minutes of moderate activity. Subjective methods of assessing physical activity rely on the subject of research being able to remember details of physical activity, including type, intensity, and frequency. Subjective methods are descriptive methods, where a person gives a verbal or written account of their various physical activities. There are different ways in which subjective assessment of physical activity can be made. They can involve interviewer-administered recall, where an individual is asked a range of questions about their physical activity over a recent period of time. They can also be based around self-administered recall. Here, individuals might complete diaries or logs of physical activity. Diaries involve individuals recording all types of physical activity carried out within a defined time frame, for example, every 30 minutes. Physical activity logs only document the particular type of activity being studied by researchers, for example, activity undertaken as part of an individual's occupation. Subjective measures can also involve proxy reports, where another person provides the information about a subject's level of physical activity. For example, a parent providing information about their child. A major disadvantage with all types of subjective measurement is their potential to be inaccurate. Recall instruments require people to remember what they have done, and memory can easily become clouded, particularly if the time span is longer than the previous week. Subjective measurement of physical activity has some advantages. It provides rich information about activity in various areas of an individual's life, and it is relatively easy to administer.
The key advantages of using subjective measures is that they tend to be quite inexpensive, and that allows us to use them with very large numbers at a population level. So we can collect physical activity data for large groups fairly inexpensively. The limitations of subjective measures is they are subject to certain biases. So social desirability bias is an issue, and that means sometimes people tell us what they think we want to hear rather than what they actually do.
Respondents providing answers they think researchers want to hear can be a problem, but so too is the reactive effect. That is, people actually changing their behaviour because of the assessment procedure. In other words, people's responses might be accurate, but their behaviour is not typical, and this is caused by the fact that they are being assessed. Summing up the advantages of subjective assessment, it is relatively easy to administer, it can be used with a large number of people, and it's inexpensive. As for the disadvantages, it is unsuitable for children under 10 and elderly people. There are problems with reliability and validity due to inaccurate memory. And finally, there may be inaccurate responses and changed behaviour because of assessment. Subjective methods of assessing physical activity rely on an individual's memory and involve recording activity through recall. Subjective methods can be interviewer-administered or self-administered. Methods include recording in diaries or logs and proxy reports. Subjective assessment of physical activity is cheap and easy to administer. Subjective assessment of physical activity covers many areas of activity. However, because it is based on people's memory, there can be problems with reliability and validity. Objective measures of physical activity involve the use of quantitative methods of measuring and recording specific activity indicators. These include monitoring of heart rate, distances travelled on foot, frequency of various motions of the body, and direct observation of physical activity. Heart rate telemetry involves monitoring the number of heartbeats per minute.
That can provide us with information about intensity of activity, duration and frequency of activity. It can't tell us anything about type, But what it does is it measures physical activity by reporting beats per minute of your heart. So there's quite a linear relationship between the intensity you're working at and the beats per minute that your heart is working at. And that's also shows a linear relationship between the beats per minute with energy expenditure. So it's a nice way of looking at increasing intensity with increasing heart rate.
Heart rate telemetry has a number of advantages. It can be used equally well in the field or in a laboratory setting, and it enables the collection of data quickly and easily. However, heart rate monitors are relatively expensive and have other disadvantages.
Most models of heart rate monitors start at around $80 and go up into the hundreds of dollars. Some of them allow you to download information over a series of days, and they tend to be far more expensive. The key limitations with heart rate telemetry is that they're quite uncomfortable to wear for long periods, so they're not the sort of thing you'd want to wear for more than 8 hours, and certainly most people would only want to wear them for 1 or 2 hours, so that's a key limitation of this approach. Also, there's a whole range of factors that influence your heart rate. If you're tired, if you're anxious and so on, so sometimes that can bias the readings and not necessarily be reflective of the level that you're working at.
Pedometers are also used for objective measurement of physical activity. They are motion sensors which respond to vertical forces. Pedometers detect the number of steps taken by the wearer or the distance covered, but they also measure other activity that involves hip movement, such as walking up and down stairs and jumping. Some pedometers can also calculate energy expenditure and the total time spent moving. In contrast to heart rate monitors, most pedometers are inexpensive. They are also more convenient to use.
The main advantages of using pedometers is that they're just amazing tools for increasing awareness of your own activity level. So after wearing a pedometer for a few days, you'll really start to get a sense of how active you are. The recommended steps for an adult is about 10,000 steps a day.
However, there are disadvantages.
They can't tell us about other types of activities, whether you're participating in basketball or what you're doing. They can't give us information about the intensity at which we're doing those steps. So as we know, it's much more difficult to walk up 100 steps than it is on the flat. So it gives us no information about intensity or total duration, the type of activity and the frequency. So it can't really measure any of the dimensions of physical activity, but it is a very useful tool in terms of behavioural change because it raises awareness.
Objective measures of assessing physical activity involve a range of methods that provide quantitative data, including heart rate telemetry and the use of pedometers. Both have advantages and disadvantages. There are 4 domains of physical activity. These are 4 areas of an individual's everyday life in which physical activity can and should occur. Firstly, occupational activity. This refers to the physical activity that is part of an individual's occupation, whether they work at a workplace or at home. For students, it is the physical activity that is part of their regular attendance at a school or other institution.
So some examples of occupational activity, they're the sorts of activities that occur during work time on a regular basis. So they tend to be things like, for tradesmen, it might be digging, carrying boxes or lifting.
Well, I guess it depends on what people's occupations are. I mean, if they've got a manual job, then they're obviously more likely to be much more active. But I think if you have a sedentary job, then it really is how can you increase your amount of activity in that day. So instead of hopping in the car, driving to work, parking in a car park, getting the lift, going and sitting down at your desk and sitting on the computer, then it's how can you build activity back into your day, either by short walks during the day, walking to and from work, you know, instead of using the car or even using the lift, can you use the stairs?
Another domain is leisure time activity. This refers to activity not done as part of time spent in an occupation or through doing chores around the home.
I mean, it's interesting how we do use leisure time and whether or not we use it actively or in a sense quite passively and from an exercise point of view, and whether or not we can also, I guess, increase our activity in getting to and from leisure. Often we take the car for quite short distances. Again, you can walk or cycle perhaps, but then also having opportunities for active recreation. Now that might be in sport, formal or informal sport. I think the more options there are, the better.
A third domain is household or gardening activity, which involves undertaking work around the home or garden, such as cleaning, painting, weeding or landscaping.
Well, I guess the opportunities that we have in the household in some ways are decreasing because of the availability of labour-saving devices.